Yes, I think for most of us, there is a personal journey involved in a project like this. And for me, it was quite straightforward, the Black Lives Matter movement. And as you remember, at that time, there was the worldwide COVID 19 pandemic going on. We all had a sense of doom about the future for various different reasons. And then there was the murder of George Floyd, which we saw actually on video endless numbers of times. And one had such a sense of disgust, horror, also hopelessness at that moment, that when that incident was followed by worldwide protests, which also linked up to movements and objections to public celebrations of racism and discrimination, starting from Rhodes Must Fall in Cape Town to Rhodes Must Fall Oxford, which had been going on for a long time. But when those movements actually sort of came together, if you like, for me, they came together with the pulling down of Colston. The statue of Edward Colston, who was a slave trader, and the statue had been in the Bristol city centre, and it was a celebration of this man. And I can't remember the exact text on the quote, which is actually there on our Cast in Stone website, but he was celebrated for being a moral man, which is like a beautiful example, or a horrible example, as you like, of institutionalized gaslighting, if you like. I mean, if the one thing he wasn't was moral, and that's what was actually written on the pedestal. So people actually, I found out at that time that actually it didn't happen out of the blue. People had been demanding the removal of that statue for years and years, and had been negotiating with the authorities that be. And one day, some people said, enough is enough. And the police stood back in that case. It also happened to coincide with the mayorship of the first mayor of color of Bristol. So anyway, around that time, actually, I had a young, just recently post PhD scholar from France, whose thesis I had examined as it happened, Julie Marquet, who is the South Asianist. Actually, she had worked on Pondicherry and caste and law in the French Empire. She got in touch and said that there was this scheme which is called Passé dans le présent, the past in the present times, if you like, which was a kind of critical heritage strand of funding that they have in France. And that this scheme had been partnered with the Arts and Humanities Research Council in Britain, and could we apply for something together? And statues seemed like the obvious thing. Statues, as I think Taupati Guha has said, are the most invisible things in public life. Nobody actually ever sees them, apart from when they're put up and when they're pulled down. But suddenly statues had become visible. So why were they attracting? Why were they becoming this lieu de mémoire, the places, sites of memory, if you like, in a completely non-Nora sense, as in these were attracting conflicting memories. People actually felt they represented something larger about the way in which colonialism continued to shape lives across the world, but especially in post-imperial nations like Britain and France. So I thought, I'll step back from this and gather those stories about statues, because there was a kind of effort to wrap these movements into what is called the culture wars in Britain, and been seen as this kind of a products of like lumpen violence and wokery and so on. But in all cases, the movements had been going on for a very long time. And each statue had its own story, as if the statue had its own life, of the actual creation of what I call supremacist icons, and then their kind of life and embeddedness in the communities that they were located in, and then they're actually becoming unrepresentative of the values that they celebrated. And I wanted to do that systematically. I do believe in systematic research. Although I'm a historian, and historians are often forced to work with unrepresentative sources, I do believe in making broader statements on the basis of a broader set of data where possible. So I also have a great love of computation and of open access research data. So I used a lot of open access data sets which are available for listed. Listed means that they have a certain status as heritage artifacts, so they're protected by certain laws in Britain. So I could download those that information from certain websites. For England and France, our French colleagues decided to use a different sort of data set, and we put it together, and we found that each statue actually links on not only to the object biography of the statue, but thematically it opens up to all sorts of things. And the kinds of things that came up included, just to give two examples, it started for me. I'm actually writing right now a story of three Clive statues in various locations in England. And one thing I'm noticing is how the artifacts that Robert Clive and his son collected from India through their various colonial looting ventures, and the various artists that they mobilized to depict themselves as heroes, those artifacts and art pieces actually make their way into the statues. So you have thrones that are actually part of certain collections which are mobilized, and the artist who has never seen a throne, has never seen a Mughal masnad, for example, actually is provided with like images of that, which they then build into the statue. An excellent example of realism being utterly fictive in many ways. At the opposite end of the spectrum, we have stuff like blackamoor statues, which, as you know, is like racially pejorative depictions of Black people, which have long histories which go back and forth from artifacts to performative histories and back and so on. So there is, for example, one clock which has a little statuette of an exaggeratedly racist Black child, which is part of the mechanism. And again, that led us to think about decoration and racial decorative tropes, and how these kind of stain, if you like, the lived environment all around us. So the project is prolific, and it's proliferating, and it continues to be both sobering and generative at the same time. Thank you. Microhistory is a love of mine, but there is a considerable genealogy of this historical methodology, which you must know of, but my hero in that context is Carlo Ginzburg. It's also a fluid methodology, in the sense that I'm not always sure what I did with the Negotiating Mughal Law book was indeed a microhistory. And in fact, the infamous second reader of that book manuscript argued very strongly that it should not be billed as microhistory because it was doing a disfavor to the project and its size. Having kept that in view, I think of microhistory in very visual terms. As in, if you zoom in to something, you see certain processes. It's actually the same processes. They are not fragments. And that's something I was quite clear about in the book. It's not about denying narrative, nor is it about fragments that cannot be connected with other things. If you think of a camera zooming in, you're observing the same processes, but you're observing them at a different scale. And just as we do with the microscope, if you actually get closer, you learn certain kinds of facts which are different from the kinds of facts that you learn, for instance, when you take a broader view. So it's a different data set, if you like. So if I actually want to know, for example, how does a landlord actually relate to the village community around them? We have structural versions of that story. As in, of course, there's the great work that Irfan Habib produced, which is the agrarian structure of the Mughal Empire. But that is a very structural view, which derives also from the regime's own depiction of itself and its processes. So, of course, the regime says that it's completely streamlined. If we read the Ain-i-Akbari, it is very clear that Abul Fazl doesn't necessarily believe, because we don't know what's in his mind, but he proposes that everything is a smoothly oiled machine, and right down to the smallest cogs in the system, this is how it's supposed to work. Actually, the whole thing must be partially fictive if we know anything about Indian society right now, right? If you think of people who get things done, If we think of formalities and rules, is that actually how anything works in any South Asian context? And that's a rhetorical question. We know that that's not the case, right? There are forms, and then there are people who will fill out those forms for you. There is an online system, and then there are booths that are set up for you to actually go to and pay them to actually use the online system for you, which is completely against the purpose of what online systems are for, right? So that must have been the case with the Mughal Empire too, and especially at the level of the people who are called Chaudharis, as in they are kind of bosses of the area. From their point of view, they see themselves often as the ubiquitous Rajaji. They're all little kings. People refer to them as Chaudhary. And in fact, like Chaudhary is both a critical term and a positive term, because when we say bahut Chaudhary ban raha hai, so it's like, trying to be a boss when nobody else has given you that position. From the point of view of the regime, they are zamindars. So there is a whole set of rules and expectations of how a zamindar is supposed to behave. And on the other hand, there is the fact that these people are already ensconced in the area, and they have done various kind of wheeling and dealing so that they become valuable to the regime, so that they are both inhabiting the state and they are constituting the state. And in many cases, they represent the only figure of state that anybody for miles around will ever see. So I think what we learn by doing a microhistory, especially at that level, is we actually find out how the Mughal Empire really functions. And this is not a story that is bereft of kings and princes. And if you actually go through the book, kings and princes keep making appearances in the story, but they are almost magical characters. So sometimes Murad Bakhsh comes and says something, the area in question is for a period under Murad Bakhsh's Jagir, and then it's moved to Dara Shuko's Jagir actually for a while. And then you have a spike in documentation in this lineage's records, where the Dara Shuko and the other princes are eliminated. Aurangzeb crowns himself again, and then they all rush to get their entitlements recorded all over again. So the broader processes are happening, and you actually do have to know that they are happening. You are also studying them, as in what does a regime's change mean? Very often we think of the Battle of Succession, and I'm talking specifically of the Battle of Succession, the battles of succession in 1658-59, when Aurangzeb eventually emerges as emperor. We think of it as dynastic history and at most the top level of nobility, as in at some point Jodhpur withdraws and goes back to their own domains, etc. But the point is that regime change has to be actuated in every single village. And we might think everybody just sat around and nobody cared that the regime changed. Actually, we find flurries of activity that take place, and the processes of smoothing out that your boss has changed. So you have to deal with that fact. And that is the kind of Mughal history that I'm interested in doing, but I do hope more and more people will do, because I think between the 1960s and 80s, historians such as Irfan Habib did this tremendous work, and let's face it, very hard work, with these very fragmented and very numerous and prolific amounts of records, which people now are reluctant to read because they are very hard to read. It's hard work. It's much easier to read a nice printed text. And let me be a little bit snide for a moment. It's very easy, relatively speaking, to read a princess's writings and then conclude something on that basis. When I say easy, I don't mean intellectually easy. It's physically easy. This takes a lot of hard work, but it has its own, shall we say, rewards. Yes, absolutely. And this relates back to what I said in relation to microhistory in response to your previous question, which is like microhistory often gives the suggestion of like a limited number of sources as well. That may indeed be the case. It may be a single trial record that we use to write a very rich history. But this is not the kind of microhistory I was doing. It's microhistory with mega data, if you like. And in fact, in terms of the amounts of data that I had to go through in order to write that story is disproportionately large. If we have like a source to output ratio, that ratio is extremely high compared to many of the other kind of historical writings of the period. Having said that, the texts I'm talking about are these very episodic documents, which is what I refer to them as. So these are what I very vaguely call legal and administrative materials. They are typically one-page texts, often highly formulaic, as in they have conventions. There are opening formula, there are middle formula, there are ending formula, there's certain layout on the page, etc. So the actual substance of the text is very, very limited, which also makes them very cryptic. And they also range from very high status documents, and yes, documents have status. So there are very high status documents included, such as a farman from an emperor. But those are very, very few and in between. Everybody wants a farman. And in fact, what amuses me a lot is that in many archives in Pakistan and India, all Persian documents are classified as farmans, because everybody wants a farman. Who wants a sale deed notarized by a poor qazi? But the fact is that the vast majority of these documents are either parvanas, which are this kind of non-royal noble orders, which are in the shape of grants. But as I also said, they are multifunctional. As I said in the book, they are often like, they can be an order like come to court tomorrow, or they can be an order like take that house. It's a nice order to give. And then you have a vast amount of what are tax contracts, because like actually zamindars have to agree to pay a certain amount of tax to the regime, which also comes back to this question of microhistory, that if we think in terms of cadastral surveys and what the state has recommended in terms of what is to be collected, it suggests that things are automatic. The regime decides that something is to be paid and people pay up. Actually, they have to get zamindars to agree to take on a contract in order to pay that amount, because they have to recoup that from the peasants who are further down the line from them. So with this vast amount of material, one of my favorite bugbear is a strange thing to say, but one of my bugbears is that these materials have been used and continue to be used as if they are kind of isolated emanations from the state, that they have no other history and no other background apart from the state. So, for example, you have a sale deed where a certain villager sells a certain amount of land to a certain Gosai in what is now Vrindavan. Do we see this as a Mughal document, or do we see this actually as part of the story of the formation of Vrindavan as a major religious and urban center? The answer is both. But in order to understand why that particular sale deed is written in the way that it is, you need to know the characters. And you need to know them beyond that document. That's often seen as impossible. It is not impossible. It requires a lot of hard work. These documents are inevitably parts of clusters that were gathered by people and curated by the people who were the rights holders at some point. Often they have undergone 3 to 10 series of curating and archiving by various regimes, and this process of curating and archiving continues. So it's really a case of that game telephone where you're trying to kind of work backwards. You're thinking that here is the document in front of me now, where might it have come from, and can I stitch it back to the original collection? I put the original in scare quotes. Normally, I don't use scare quotes, but in this case, I will, because the original is necessarily provisional. You can never know how it was actually stored. You can only speculate. And the limits of the archive are always unknown. And you see the curating of it happening even at the time. So if there is a landed lineage, it tries to prune its branches, as in it doesn't want to have too many shariks, too many sharers. It tries to get rid of the black sheep of the family. So it erases them from the family. So the family's collection will not have the documents which relate to the rights of that family. And you can actually begin to see traces of that pruning if you try to put that collection together. So, whenever people come to me with collections of documents, which may also be printed, and actually the vastest number of these are in the Marathi language collections that we have, which were collected by Marathi language writing historians in the early 20th century. I asked people, and they're called things like Oturkar collection, etc. I asked people try to work out where these documents came from. It is very hard because the Marathi historians inflicted various kinds of violence on these collections, including pruning out anything in Arabo-Persian script from the collections and only taking the either, in most cases, it's Mori script, Marathi material. So sometimes you have traces of the Persian material and you have to imagine them together. So I suggest that think of those collections. Don't think of the documents in isolation. There may be very good reasons to do that, but when people only look at an isolated document and say something like, the state did this, I feel very cross. But that's me and how my research has developed. Sayyid Amir Ali, I have this tendency of making friends with people whose lives are many centuries in the past. I think Sayyid Amir Ali is an unlikely friend that I have. I wonder if we would have been friends if we had met, and I'd like to think that we would. He was a crusty, anglicized Muslim gentleman, which is how he would, other than the crusty, he would describe himself like that as well. I think I would get along with him, actually. He is a neglected figure. You keep coming across him, and he comes across as a boring liberal. That's the whole problem. He doesn't come across as an authentic indigenous scholar, because if you're looking for them, you would be looking either at the Nadwa, or you are looking at the Deoband school or other kind of modern madrasas or continuing madrasas, the Firangi Malis, etc. But this guy, he is the first Indian on the final court of appeal of the British Empire, the Privy Council. He just seems too anglicized to be interesting. Also, people don't generally read jurisprudential treatises for fun. I do, that's me. When I actually read some of his judgments, and I came across them because actually it's becoming relevant once again for my first book, which was on the Christian minority community, for want of a better word, in South Asia. I did some work on the Waqf Act. And when you work, which is very topical again now, and when you work on the Waqf Act and its history, there is no way you can avoid Amir Ali. And while it is tricky to actually say now what Amir Ali said is not very dissimilar, but for very different reasons of what the regime in India is saying right now, which is that the Waqfs are being misused, that they can be made better use of for members of the community, and they ought to be. And at every step, he's blocked by conservatives who say that actually to divert funds from these to what are essentially modern purposes is misuse of these funds. And there is this guy called Abdul Latif who really blocks him and so on. Amir Ali is also central. From there, I found out in a very important case, which is about Waqf ala al-Aulad, which is about waqfs made to benefit members of the family of the person who's making the waqf itself. So there's a very famous case of Abul Fatah. That case, actually, I did some research on the side on that family as well, after all, and it turned out to be a very different case than what it is in the legal framework. I'll tell you about that later on. But this case, Amir Ali was very important in the build up to this case. And while in his relative youth, he had been saying that Waqf should be redirected, etc., by the time he comes to the 1890s, and by this time he's an illustrious judge in the Calcutta High Court, he has come to actually feel that what is really important is to keep this property and these resources within the community no matter what. And so Waqf ala al-Aulad can be seen on the one hand as an instance of, let me say it, corruption. Right? You are making a waqf, you are basically taking property out of the ordinary lines of inheritance, potentially disinheriting women who are given property rights in Islamic law. So you're only directing it to a particular object. And then on top of that, you are making particular members of the family beneficiaries of that property. So it's just corrupting lines of inheritance. I won't say just, but it can be a way of corrupting lines of inheritance. And it can be anti-women in some cases, right? So, but why does Amir Ali support this position? First is this kind of emotional investment and understanding that these resources need to be kept. But what was very interesting for me is the range of Islamic legal literature that he mobilizes in order to make the make the claim that he does, which is that Waqf ala al-Aulad is a completely traditional Islamic legal provision. And in the historiography that I had read, people only know about the Hidayah and they know about the Fatwa-e Alamgiriya, right? So, and we know that the Hidayah was translated and the Hidayah actually still remains applicable in Pakistani courts, among others, also in India. So was there just that one text that everybody read? And I asked so many people, like as in, what were people who were jurists, the alims, what were they actually studying in terms of law books? And all people could tell me was that there is the Fatwa al-Hindiya, or alternatively known as the Fatwa al-Alamgiriya, and the Hidayah. And I thought that wasn't possible. And then I look at Amir Ali's judgments. And by the way, judges are not supposed to do this, but he had a reputation of lecturing the lawyers from the bench. So he used to deliver their arguments on their behalf. And I sort of imagine this moment of him kind of leaning down from the bench going, no, let me tell you what the law is. And his judgments are extremely long. And they give such a range of scholarship, which he clearly, like a modern Orientalist and using the knowledge of modern European Orientalists, had actually started to find out about. So one very simple project I actually did was to list the books that he cites and try to find out what are these books. How did he find out about these books? How could he have had access to these books? And I tried to trace their publication history. And I came to the very, for me, quite surprising conclusion that all these books were published, printed, and circulating in Calcutta at the time that he's writing this judgment. So rather than this very sparse legal landscape, there's a rich legal landscape of Islamic legal thinking, writing, and consuming, which he is tapping into, which I thought was amazing. And I thought at a certain point that I'll write a biography of the man inside as well from outside. The inside is not traceable because he instructed his family members to burn his papers. So we only have the outside, which actually now I think is good. I think we should relinquish this search for interiority. If people have not wished to deliver a vision of their inner self, we should stop stripping people of how they have wished to present themselves. And I respect Amir Ali's judgment on that point. I have a huge collection of his judgments, which are not digitized because they are in the Indian law reports. He actually had very interesting things to say about Hindu law as well, which I thought I would write a side article on at some point. So I have all those judgments. I have his Privy Council judgments. I also have all the law books that he wrote. And there's, of course, like he was a prolific letter writer to the press. So I have all that material. My friend Amir Ali deserves my attention, and I should write this biography sometime soon. And I almost can tell what Amir Ali is going to say at a certain moment. You live with a person long enough, you kind of know what they're going to say in this case. But I have to pay that tribute after a few years because I've got a few more books to write. That's a very rich, multi-layered question, and there are many books on this topic. But let me try and summarize what I know and add the very little that I'm trying to add to that knowledge. I think it's a great place to start with a straw man to knock down so that one then moves on. So Charles Grant the evangelical company official, has a comment on this actually, where he is arguing for the replacement of Persian with English as the imperial language. And in summary, what he says is Indians have learned a foreign language before, so what's the big deal? They can learn English now. So we could go with that, as in it's basically like Persian is replaced by English. And actually, in many ways, that is true. In so many sociological ways, it is comparable. It is indeed a foreign language. People still learn English in a way that is highly artificial. Often, South Asians can write much better English than native English speakers, but they cannot necessarily speak it, which brings us back to Persian. Replace the English with Persian. This would be true for Persian as well. English pronunciation in South Asia has been the source of unkind joking and continues in some areas to be the source of unkind jokes. Same for Persian. There is a kind of self-assuring story, I think, that people who study Indo-Persian arena kind of say that in fact Indian Persian is more authentic in terms of its phonetics. I think the evidence base of that is quite limited, simply because historically it's very hard to trace sound. So there are similarities. There is another similarity which actually I have not heard anybody talk about in a systematic way. What people often don't comment on is that vernacular language use is also part of Anglicist policy. So Charles Metcalfe, about whom Catherine Pryor had this article about, he's one of the evangelicals, he's also the brother-in-law of Thomas Babington Macaulay, and he has this whole thing about Persian being this artificial foreign language whose whole purpose is to confuse people and to give a small number of people extraordinary and undeserved control over others, simply by the control of the language itself. But alongside saying that we should replace it with English, what he's really saying is that we should replace it with the vernaculars. And in fact, when the funding is removed from Orientalist study, most of the money actually goes also towards setting up of these Anglo-vernacular schools. So I don't have the facts and figures to hand on that one straight away. In fact, that vernacular, which is taught in these schools and becomes part of language policy, that varies region to region. That is not necessarily the vernacular that you might expect. So there is no immediate connection between popular speech and the vernacular that is chosen. The outstanding example of that is the Punjab, where the vernacular that is chosen is Urdu, which, as you know, is not the, if you like, native speech of people out there, but it is also a learned language, but that is the one that is made the formal vernacular in that area, which is a good alert to us to think of the vernaculars that are in fact chosen in other areas, and we are still talking about the British now, are in fact highly stylized languages which have gone through various processes of modification and modernization, including the writing of dictionaries and grammars, and often the input of Christian missionaries whose need for language was paramount because of the need to communicate the word of God. So the number of dictionaries that William Carey writes, for example, is part of the story of the creation of the vernacular. It's also important to remember, and it's still the case, that often that vernacular is so stilted that people can't understand what is being said. So if you still think of this continuing process of modernizing the vernaculars, the Hindi that you find in Government of India forms, for example, is, I won't say incomprehensible, but very, very hard to understand for most people who are native speakers of Hindi, because nobody talks like that. It's a made vernacular. It's an administrative vernacular. So my finding now, stepping 200 years back, mainly from the 17th century onwards, from which we have the prolific paperwork really, is that you do see bilingual documents and biscriptural documents as well in the Mughal period. Much as we would like them to be more prolific, in fact, they are not. My finding is around 10% of these documents have any vernacular element, which is not to say that the vernaculars are not being developed in other spheres. They are clearly being developed in the literary and religious spheres, but those are different kinds of texts. If we are actually talking of state processes and administrative processes, the same person who, for example, is writing, Podaboli literature in case of the Vaishnavas, and they may be writing it in Maithili, which later on becomes known as Brajaboli, or they may be writing in Braj. In this case, the same group of people did not, but we will leave it aside. But when they actually come to, for example, selling or buying land, they will use Persian. And the interesting thing is, and in my mind, Vrindavan is foremost because I've been dealing with this, these Bengali Vaishnav Gosais who are clearly composing literary and literature and religious literature in particular in very often in Maithili or Brajbuli or in other forms of Bengali. When it comes to buying and selling land, not only are they using Persian, but they are often using a kind of Hindi. So these are Bengali monks using Hindi for the administrative vernacular to buy land in the area that is Vrindavan. Why are they doing that? My answer to that is because that is the administrative vernacular which has been developed, and this is a hypothesis which is untested during the Mughal period. And I think specifically in the 17th century, it is actually being developed. Now, what is that Hindi that I just mentioned that you perhaps see in Vrindavan sale deeds? Irfan Habib called it Braj, and with the greatest respect to a scholar like that, I'm not wholly convinced that is Braj. Braj is the native speech of the area, but as I have been trying to argue, the native speech is not necessarily the administrative vernacular. So you cannot take a one-to-one that will be Braj. And Braj is, as you also know, a translocal literary language. Now, Braj, to identify something as Braj, you might think that you can impose a lexical and a grammatical model on it, and you can tell whether or not it's Braj. Anything you look up close disappears. That is the problem, of course. And it doesn't seem like Braj to me, which is a very, very badly evidenced way of questioning great linguists and historians. But I think I need to look into it more because the verb endings, the pronouns that you actually see in these documents are to me much closer to the kind of Rajasthani type Hindi that actually I see in many Mughal documents from central India right up to what is now Rajasthan. And for central India, I have heard them referred to as Malvi or in the written form as Rangri. Some people say it's Dhundhari, which is like the eastern Rajasthan kind of material. But to me, to an untutored person, they seem more Rajasthani than Braj. But, as they say, watch this space. I'll have to find out what it is. Absolutely. I think apart from all the other adjectives that you used in connection with these two scholars, we need to add another one, and that is generosity. And I think, and I feel very strongly about this actually, and I think we don't. Many of us do cultivate it, but I think we need to cultivate it more articulately in our academic lives. There is something called academic ethics, and we need to kind of work on that. I think that requires compassion, that requires generosity, and that requires a willingness to both respect the work that has been done before us and the willingness to pave the way for people who will come after us. And I think all these things are actually absolutely necessary. Well, maybe they're not necessary. You can actually do scholarship in a combative, selfish way, and that does advance knowledge. I will not make comments flippantly here, but I leave like whoever's listening to this to actually think of unkind scholarly practices, everything from the humanities to the sciences. Yes, progresses were made in medicinal research, for example, in the most shameful of circumstances. And can we reject those advances? Possibly not. But I like to not do that. So let me actually say it here that apart from being great historians, these two scholars are also unbelievably generous. So to both of them, I actually wrote following on their classic books, as it happens for Professor Eaton, Rise of Islam and the Bengal Frontier, and for Professor Habib, his latest book, which is Braj Bhoom in Mughal Times. I asked to see their materials. Many scholars would have said no, because it can be seen as impugning their work as historians. You're asking to check their working, right? It can be seen like that. None of them, and this is true greatness, where you are willing to let that happen because you have such confidence in your own work. So there's a long story which I won't go into about the accessing of these materials, but the materials are of different nature. So Professor Eaton's materials are in the shape of photographs of the materials. These photographs were taken 40 years ago. It would be very hard in Bangladesh, which was a new nation at the time. It will be very hard to find the original documents even if they have survived. In Professor Habib's case, the material is even more complex because Professor Habib was actually in Professor Habib's case, the collection is much more diverse and much larger as well. Although I went to him looking for documents that related to Mughal Vrindavan, and there are 200 such documents, the collection itself, that is Professor Habib's collection, which he has expressed willingness for me to photograph in its entirety, I have to think of how to do that, is, as he said to me, research he has collected over 70 years. So I've managed to take 2,000 photographs last month. And my assessment is that that is 1/200th of the material that is in the steel cabinet. And actually, it is in the shape of documents as well, because that's how he takes notes. It's not, I went there, now I feel like a scavenger. I wanted to just get at the materials. By going there and actually looking at the materials and going through this process of disappointment, which is that he did not have the photocopies of the documents to hand. What he had were his own transcriptions. And in some cases, I have to say this, the documents consist of documents that were transcribed in Latin script by a Sanskritist in the 70s and then retranscribed back to Nagari by Professor Habib, because he, like me, finds it very hard to actually read any form of Hindi in Latin script. So he needed to have it in Nagari, so he wrote it himself. So think of the levels of remove that we actually go through from the documentation. Having said that, those may be the only remains of those documents, because I haven't been able to track down the majority of those documents so far. But I learned much more than that. And this is why I want to put the entirety of both collections, properly curated with good metadata, on a portal which is called SDS, and it's actually on the Figshare platform, which is a beautiful platform. People should use it, and it's hosted. It's connected by the University of Oxford. It teaches you how to do research as well. So Professor Habib's notes are never just transcriptions. They are often transcriptions. They can be part translations. There are excerpts from sources, other sources that he has read and he has related to them. They can be excerpts and summaries of books that he has read and he has related to them. And then the best of all are his comments on them as well. And the first gift that he gave me, and I shall treasure that for the rest of my career, is he said, "Would you like to see my notes on your book?" And there are these 20 pages that he then shared with me, which are actually, to be correct, is on the Dhar documents, of which he had seen a small portion, the one that is in Kuwait. And then he had also found out, being Irfan Habib, that there's a corresponding collection that was at the National Archives. So actually, I had unwittingly, for my book, walked in his footsteps. It really does give me the shivers to kind of realize that. But so he had been taking notes on those documents. And then in the last 2 pages, It actually starts now. Nandini Chatterjee has written a book about it, and then in the beginning he's quite critical, and then he actually cut out the critical section. And then when he handed me this, he said, "I think I was a bit critical. Sorry." And I said, "Well, it's an honor to be noticed by you." And he said, "You know what? I think I was a bit jealous, and I will treasure that for the rest of my life." Thank you for asking. I do have a tendency of having my fingers in too many pies, and that's a character fault. But they're all thematically connected in my mind. So it all keeps wrapping back in one way or the other on law at its like functional level. How do people understand it? And the core idea is justice, really, what people understand to be justice, how they seek it, and so on. And on the other side, language. So these keep kind of cropping up again and again, and not because I love it, but because it's ubiquitous. And empires, because empires are these multi-ethnic, layered, hierarchical, necessarily oppressive regimes that in which most humans have lived until recently, and many do even now. So the project which we haven't talked about so far is that I got a little grant from the British Academy to run a British Academy project. And these are kite marked projects, which means that the British Academy thinks that this project will be of wider use to the academic community, and they're resource creation projects. So archiving and the use of computation is another thing that threads itself to my work. This particular one is an effort to digitize the Fatwa-e-Alamgiri in the Arabic. And before you ask, I do read some Arabic. I'm slow, but I have got a great collaborator who is Mahmoud Kuria, who is one of the few people who's actually written about pre-modern Islamic law, and he's an expert in South Asia, and he is an expert on Shafi law. He mainly works on the southwest of India. So we have a good pairing, I would like to argue. And our plan is to do a pilot study. The text itself there's a very good but non-scholarly edition which was published from Beirut, I think 2011. And that text is available on Shamila. And the idea is that it will be ingested by this magnificent digitization project called Kitab, which is of Arabic text, which allows, because of its computational abilities, for us to overlap any of the 8,000 texts that is there in its corpus to see what kind of overlaps we have. So we can actually tell which legal terms, for example, occur in how many texts. And we can also check correlations. Like if you have, for example, Waqf, which legal scholar is cited, we can actually check the correlations across a huge data set. So our idea is to actually translate it to English and then do quite rich encoding. And encoding means that it will become tagged in a way that when it's displayed on screen, you can click the name of a scholar. The moment a scholar is cited, you click the name of the scholar, you find out more about that scholar's life, their entire corpus. If any of their texts are digitized, then links to their texts, certainly a bibliography and any publications on that. Similarly, if there is a legal concept, then there will be expositions of that concept. And what one hopes to do, because it's a proof of concept thing, is to allow mapping and correlating of these things. So it's my indirect tribute actually to Amir Ali, which is to try and understand what is the intellectual landscape in a narrow jurisprudential sense for the huge number of scholars led by Sheikh Burhanpuri, who compiled the Fatwa. And let us see where that goes. We have 5 years to do this, and we have proposed that we will look at 100 pages of that material. So at the end of this, I really hope that we have that material online for people to use. And my aim is to actually prove to people that an Islamic jurisprudential text can be rollicking fun.